Experience can often act as a great teacher of knowledge and an accelerant in determining our passions and where we want to have the most impact in life. For James McWalter, the answer to that very question is positively contributing to the debate around climate change. Currently, he's working on a startup to decarbonize food supply chains. He also hosts the Carbotnic Podcast, where he has long-form discussions with experts in the area of clean tech. He joined me this week to have an interesting discussion surrounding the future of climate change. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Welcome you to the program, and I'm excited to learn all of the exciting work that you do in your work with startups. Great to be with you this afternoon, and thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's a delight.
So, James, I know that you're currently working to decarbonize food supplies through food chains, through startups. So I'm wondering if we can talk about all the great work that you're currently doing with your endeavor there, Bob.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, I think a lot of us are starting to realize the incredible problems associated with climate. And so there's this massive movement across entrepreneurs and the government and individual consumers to have less carbon intensive, food, buildings, and everything in between. And so I'm specifically looking at, the food that we all eat, the beverages that we buy. How do we make that zero carbon or carbon negative? And so I'm looking at building ways to measure carbon across the food supply chain, from the farmer all the way up to the individual consumer, and then use that data to help everybody make the lower carbon decision. There's a lot of kind of interesting ways to run a supply chain for food, and some of them are way less carbon intensive than others. And really, with good data is kind of, in my view, one of the kind of primary ways we can push people to do the better thing.
And I know one of the ways that you do that is by hosting a podcast. So tell me about the podcast, how people can listen, because I know you have a long-form discussions just like we do with this podcast. So I'd love to know about your efforts there as well.
Yeah, and absolutely, Kevin. So, I suppose my kind of journey into working on climate is less than 18 months old. It all started just over a year ago, really. And before I decided to start a company in the space, first I felt I needed to learn a lot more about, climate from every different angle. And, I'm in my kind of late 30s now. I didn't really want to go back to university. So I had to kind of think about how could I learn about climate very rapidly. And so I decided to kind of create a podcast where I get to talk to, climate founders and investors about what the companies are working on and how they're having some sort of climate effect. And so I founded the Carbotnic Podcast. I can send you the link so we can have that in the show notes. But basically, I'll speak to mostly founders, but sometimes people in industry and people in the investment side as well. And we'll talk for about 40 minutes about how their product or how their company is working to decarbonize something. Typically, I'm looking mostly again at food and agriculture because those are the things that interest me. But we've talked to everybody, from people who have sensors that prevent, fruit from being unripe, all the way to different types of satellite imagery use cases, battery technology, and everything in between. And so, yeah, I similar to yourself, Kevin, like I love doing kind of podcasting. You learn so much, and it's just a great opportunity to talk to really interesting people.
Yeah, absolutely. And you learn and try to be educated by the conversations you have, right? So, and then just before I ask you about your previous experience in the personal training marketplace space,
Sure.
I'm curious to ask you about the price of groceries and how agriculture is becoming more expensive, especially in the United States. And how do you think we can drive down the cost of food as well?
I suppose that's a very kind of interesting question. And so I suppose, speak to some of the history for why food is the price it is. And so, basically, previous to the 1940s, like basically previous to World War II, food was very local. We did not have these very complex supply chains. The food that people typically ate were probably within 100 miles of where they lived. But since then, we kind of developed these incredibly complex supply chain systems using things like container ships and so on. And one of the attributes of that system drove down the cost of certain ingredients more than others. We also had the development of certain types of agricultural practices in the likes of the United States and Canada, which also drove down the price of food. And we also developed kind of new approaches to synthetic fertilizers, which also allowed us to really grow a lot on a particular amount of land. All of those effects drove down the price of food to, America's and North America's food market is the cheapest food in the world on a per capita basis for a very long time. I would argue that some of those things that drove down the cost of food hid the real cost to things like the environment. And so while I definitely don't want a world where the cost of food doubles or triples, one of the aspects of the cost of groceries is that the actual price of that groceries is not fully captured by the price that the typical consumer is paying, because all of the damage to the environment or the damage to certain types of soil, the damage to wildlife is not really being paid for. And so I think one of the things that we really need to do as we try to make more sustainable food supply chains and food is balance the needs of consumers to have a good price for the food that they buy, along with the needs of the environment that we all live in, for it not to be crushed. And so I think these are difficult things, and I think there's a role for government regulation. There's a goal there's a role of innovation, and there's also a role, for consumers to be vote with their wallets and vote for things that are, that they think like reflects their own values.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also curious to get your thoughts on how the personal training marketplace has changed, because I know you founded a company called Hale before you did this work. So I'm wondering your thoughts and feelings in that space as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I actually founded that company with my brother, Ian, and another friend up in Vancouver, Canada, about 4 years ago now. And, I suppose we did all the usual mistakes that first-time founders do. We built more product than, we tested in the market. And so at that time, my brother is a personal trainer, and we were trying to figure out a way to get in-person training and scale that. So if you're a personal trainer, you could go visit somebody's home, or they could come to your independent gym But one of the things we found was that the margins for a lot of this is quite difficult when you have in person, because it's very expensive for a highly trained person to get into a car or get onto a bus and go and visit somebody in person. One of the remarkable things that we obviously didn't understand back 4 years ago, but I think a lot of people can understand today, is how COVID changed the fitness market. And so everything is now digital first. You have personal trainers who have their entire business online. And actually my younger sister, who's also a personal trainer, that's how she started. She does all of her work fully online using videos and, email and all this kind of thing. And then we also see the likes of Peloton and Tonal and some of these products that allow people to engage with a trainer or engage with an instructor in a digital format while they're also working out at home. And so I think these are the areas that are going to have ever more innovation. I think home fitness is definitely here to stay. And I still think there's definitely a role for the in-person, personal trainer, but that's always going to be pretty expensive. There's always going to be more of a premium market. And so I think the ability to get more people access to high quality, physical training of various types is going to definitely be more digital going forward.
With you saying that, I'm also curious to ask you, how do you think gym owners can help attract people back to the gym once COVID has subsided?
Yeah, I mean, gym ownership is a really tough business to be in. Like a lot of businesses, right? You need a lot of square footage, and you are paying rent even during COVID, unless you've had some sort of debt, rent forgiveness. These are big, wide open spaces. Typically, they're only busy a couple of hours in the morning and the evening, so they're just like empty and with expensive air conditioning the rest of the day. And so generally, gym owner margins are pretty low. I think the best gym owners are really thinking through like how to kind of remove concerns around health, right? So, we are keeping things clean. We are keeping the air circulating in a certain way. But I think also the best gym owners are really going to have to think through about how to rebuild a sense of community. We've all been very siloed in the last year. And so I think there's like an incredible opportunity to engage people as people, like that we can all start connecting with each other. We can be in a room together, hopefully soon with the vaccine rollout. And so I think the best gym owners will try to incorporate community, meetups, all that kind of thing.
And James, you shared with me before this started, if people haven't picked up on it yet, that you're originally from Ireland, and I know that you have a lot of life and professional experience. So I'm wondering if you can encapsulate that for me, and if you had to summarize it in a word or a sentence, what do you think that might be?
Yeah, so I suppose curiousness. I'm endlessly curious about different things, and so it's very like it's I suppose it's pretty difficult for me to get bored by anything. I think there's interest and something that I can be curious about in pretty much all things. That does mean you tend to jump around a lot, as you mentioned. So I've worked in finance and fitness, and now I'm working on climate. But I think like a lot of these different industries have more in common than you'd think from the outside. Like in the end, you're still trying to solve problems for people with a product or service that they can afford, right? And like so you carry those principles across all these different kind of types of projects. And so so I'm just constantly curious, and I love learning. And yeah, so that's I suppose the main one.
And I'm curious, what do you miss most about back home in Ireland, Bud?
Yeah, I mean, definitely my family. We have scheduled, so I have two sisters and my mother still living in Ireland. And we scheduled my mother's 60th birthday for the end of August. So hopefully there'll be enough travel restrictions lifted so that we can make that trip, my brother and I. And yeah, I just miss hanging out. There are certain aspects of Irish culture that honestly I struggled a little bit with when I was a young lad. I liked, I have a fair amount of ambition. I love traveling. I love getting out and about. And some of these things, Ireland can be somewhat inward looking in certain areas. But, when I go back, like those first 2 weeks back there are just so good because, the stories, the ability for people to kind of make, fun of tough moments in a positive way, I think is really, really powerful. And, we're obviously collectively, we're all going through a very tough year and a half. And, I think the Irish sense of humor can be very helpful in those kind of moments.
And there's no place like home, right? Absolutely. I think there are a lot of people that are missing the comforts of normalcy, and certainly, hopefully, things will get back to normal soon. But I'm also curious to know, when you're not working, what do you like to do for fun, James?
Yeah, I mean, these days, just walk the dog and go for a bit of a run. But I suppose what I'm really looking forward to is getting back to like, clubbing, festival culture. So, I'm my wife, myself, my brother, my close friends. We love going to big music festivals, big nights out where you're just dancing for like 10 hours. I haven't done that now in quite a while. We did try to have a kind of COVID bubble home dance party for like 8 friends like a month ago, and that was quite fun. But it was just eight of us like in our living room. But I'm looking forward to getting back out into just dancing around people. Like it feels so strange to imagine being around tons of people who are sweating and dancing, but I'm looking forward to that.
Absolutely. A little bit of normalcy goes a long way. And I've told a lot of people through the pandemic that I'll never underestimate or undervalue the power of human connection anymore.
Absolutely. I think that's there are different ways that my wife and we talk about like restructuring our lives in specific ways so that we can maintain more connections, right? Like there are people that, are some of the most important people in my life, and I haven't been in the same room as them for, 18 months. And like that's something that, maybe something like this happens again, but in the meantime, we definitely want to kind of restructure the types of things we do so that we are spending, Christmases and holidays with certain family members and so on.
And James, I'm curious if you've given any thought to the legacy you want to leave and the imprint that you want to leave on the world, buddy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think a huge amount about like personal direct legacy. My wife and I, we don't want kids or anything, so like it's not like I typically think too much about that. But one of the things I do think about is the compounding nature of events over time. And so if you make some sort of action today that can have a small impact today, but a large impact over time, that could have just a small impact today and then it kind of fades out. And so I'm constantly thinking about like, what are the kind of high leverage things that can be done today that if they get rolling can have very, very large impact in the future. And so that's why, I'm working on things in the climate space, like the kind of approaches that I'm taking to the technology within climate, they're not going to remove a huge amount of carbon from the atmosphere this year or next year, but on a 20, 50, 100-year time horizon, they have a chance of doing a lot of good. And again, these are risky things, so you may not actually, we may not be successful, but I'm kind of always thinking about like those kind of things. And, like I suppose the magical moment is like there's somebody 200 years from now whose life has been made better by something you've done. You'll never really know whether you had that effect, and they won't know that you were part of their history. But, I suppose it's one of the things that can help drive us along.
And finally, just very quickly, how can people get connected with you if they're so inclined to do that?
Yeah, you can go to James_MC Walter, which is my kind of Twitter. And then the podcast is Carbotnic, CARBOTNIC.com. You can find me there. And yeah, you just look for James McWalter on LinkedIn. Like there's not that many of us. And I'm always interested in connecting people, particularly if people are interested in, getting involved in climate, no matter what their interest is. I know tons of people in the space, and I love connecting people to try and have more people work on the climate space in particular. And so always feel free to reach out to me.
Absolutely. I have one follow-up that I forgot to ask you. What do you
Sure.
think about the new governmental approach with the new administration as it comes to climate change? And what would be your parting message to anyone who is concerned about the state of our climate as well?
Yeah, so I think a little bit cut off at the end, but basically, they're on the Biden administration. They've done a few really positive things for climate. So, big companies who drive a lot of the problem with climate, have very specific structures that enable them to do things well or badly. And a lot of those are around words like compliance and like the internal financialization of like big companies. And so like a big company like Walmart or a big company like Microsoft, they will have a compliance department and they do various things, right? They try to respect certain types of laws and all this kind of thing. If you do not have a type of law or a way to engage with those compliance departments, things just don't happen, right? Like a lot of these, very few of these companies are going to do something for the, just for the fun, right? Like even if it's really important and positive. And so one of the interesting things I think that the Biden administration has done is take, rules around climate risk and said to the SEC, which is one of the kind of big regulatory bodies for public companies, and it said, add climate risk to the SEC regulations. And what this now means is that all these big companies, they now have to ask their compliance department to start thinking about climate risk in some way. And like, it sounds like, I suppose, a kind of something behind the scenes and a minor change, but it will mean now, and you actually already see it in the job boards, there are tens of thousands of sustainability people being hired in compliance departments to try to work on climate. And it's just that one change. And so that's the first of many changes. I know there's a large infrastructure bill that has a very, very large green component. I'm excited about that. There's been an uptick in the kind of grants, the R&D grants that the government is giving for climate related work. I'm actually myself, I just applied for a sizable 7-figure grant. So hopefully that'll be granted and we'll see how that goes. And so, yeah, in general, I think, this is, these are all the things that we should, probably the bare minimum we should be doing is what's happening, but that's so much better than what was previously happening. It's pretty exciting. And yeah, so I'm pretty happy with the current kind of government.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just follow up since we get cut off on my last question. I'm curious, what would be your parting message to anyone that wants to get into the climate fight, who may be concerned about climate? What do you think people can do to support the cause to create a cleaner and safer climate?
I think the most important thing is to really just start asking questions about why the people in their lives, that they themselves are not working directly on climate. Climate affects literally everything from social justice to water to how we build our buildings, to how we drive our cars, to how we walk, to how we talk. Like literally every aspect is going to be affected by climate over the next 20 to 50 years. And so I think there's an amazing opportunity for people to just start asking the questions about, who do I know who's working on climate? Because a lot of us don't know anybody like that, and say, oh, why don't I know anybody? And just having a lot more of those conversations, I think will dramatically help, because there might be some people who are interested in doing work in that space, either joining a company or changing jobs, and they just don't really feel the peer pressure to do so because people don't talk about these things enough. And so that'd be the main one. I think, obviously it's better to vote for, the types of politicians who understand this stuff better than the ones who don't. That's always a positive. But I think really just like talking about climate more and about, what can you yourself do? What kind of job changes can you do to be involved in climate in some way? I think that will have the most effect.
Hey, James, I really want to thank you for spending some time with me talking about startups, the work that you're doing to create a cleaner climate, and a little bit about your Irish heritage. Really enjoyed our conversation, and I want to thank you for being here this afternoon. It's most appreciated.
Thank you very much, Kevin. These are great questions, and I really appreciate it.